Jehan, thank you very much for joining us here on AU Manufacturing Conversations. Delightful to meet you by phone.
It's great to meet you too, Brent, and great honour to be selected to join on the podcast.
Oh, think nothing of it. Let's get a little bit acquainted. The first question I like to ask guests, and yourself included among those, is how did you get here and what do you make?
So I'm the founder and CEO of Rux Energy. We are a hydrogen storage startup. So we develop advanced nanoporous materials called metal organic frameworks. And these help us store hydrogen in a much more efficient way within a pressurized cylinder. So effectively, we make these, you can think of them as molecular sponges. They're crystalline materials that we make, crystallize within water, dry them out, press them together and put them into a tank. And it doubles the volumetric density of the hydrogen. And so we effectively halve the cost of the storage component within a hydrogen integrated system. And the storage component, I mean, that might seem like it's just, a big efficiency for a small thing, but actually the storage really accounts for about 20 to 30% of the total value of, say, a hydrogen truck or a hydrogen plane. In fact, even with planes, it's more like 40% of the total value because there's so much storage required for those larger vehicles. So if we can really provide that both performance gain where you get a double the range on your trucks, allow them to go from 500 kilometers up to 12 to 1500 kilometers, and that's a big win for the energy transition because effectively we can start to switch over from diesel because really diesel trucks, the drivers are worried about what's my range going to be when I first buy the truck, but also what's my range going to be 20 years after I start buying this truck. Is it going to degrade? Do I get progressively less range? Do I have to replace the batteries if it's a battery electric vehicle? So we design these materials and we design our systems really to have that sort of 25-year long, at least, life cycle, similar to how solar panels can, they give a 25-year warranty on those. And many solar panels have been up for 40 years and still work pretty well. And that's actually really very, very, the usability of these systems is going to be really key to getting people to switch over.
Sure. We'll get back into the molecular sponges in a little bit, but for some context sake, I'd like to know a little bit of your life and times. I noticed your surname and I thought, I wonder if you're a relation to Marlene Kanga and to the other Kangas I've heard of. And it turns out you are, and that's a very interesting family to come from. You guys are doing all sorts of things. Tell me something about what early life was like if you want to, and if family was a big influence in your career.
Absolutely. I hate to think it was because I was like a very headstrong, very science-focused nerd kid at school. Mm-hmm. And I loved chemistry and, because I also love cooking and, I've got all of Nigella's books. But when I went into chemistry, I think my mum thought it's like, you should do something more practical than basic science. You should do engineering if you're interested in technology. And I was like, no. I really want to do this. This is the molecular atom stuff is what I love. And so she was, very supportive. But even in the early days, I mean, she was the one that taught me a lot of the science that I do know and was very encouraging. She never really pushed me. She just, facilitated my own interest in science and maths and music as well, actually. And she was very active in supporting me. And, I was a young violinist. I actually played professionally the violins for a number of years in my early 20s and became a choral conductor. And that was, she was just, wherever my nose went, she was, to her credit, extremely supportive. And also, I think, I do have her and my father, who's in the AI software spaces, mm-hmm. as mentors. And especially for her, I saw how hard she had to fight as a woman in engineering in Australia. She was one of the first 4 women in engineering. She was one of the co-founders of the Women in Engineering Network in Australia in the late 70s. And it was a phone network with 4 women in 4 different sites around the country. And that's how few women were in the whole sector. And she still faces, even today, levels of discrimination. She's received an Order of Australia and that sort of stuff. And often sort of other people in the field sort of scoff at what she's done. But, she really has done an incredible amount of sustainability work in clean water, risk engineering, supporting, nations across the Pacific, like earthquake risk and environmental management and then also done a whole lot of capacity building, New Colombo Plan, Innovation Australia, done a whole lot of sustainability projects when she was on the board at Sydney Water. So she's really been in the renewable energy space and clean water, clean tech, and adjacent to innovation, and for a long, long, long time. And so I could see how her values translated into her technical work, and that's something that I'm bringing into the way that I work. Is that we're a very values-oriented company, and we want to change the way that people think about startups as being not just about this sort of single bottom line, grow as quickly as you can, pump and dump kind of business. We are here for the long haul. We want to force an increase in the velocity of the energy transition, and we're willing to actually pay a part of that cost, in order to help our supply chain also, decarbonize as quickly as possible through Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions work.
And so a bit of a shift of gears here. Let's go back to metal organic frameworks. The molecular sponges you mentioned earlier, I guess I'd count myself among such people, but not everyone knows what an MOF is, what it does, how they're made. Tell me about what they are and what drew you to them as a researcher and later as an entrepreneur.
So a bit of background on what I actually have in my pitch slides. It's got WTF is a MOF. Get lost in some geographies and other jurisdictions, you get stone cold faces. Right. These materials are highly ordered atomic nets. These are sort of framework materials that you almost think of them as like scaffolding. Like when you look at a big scaffolding on the side of a building, it's got nodes and bridges that connect the nodes. And then there's lots of empty space. But this is at a molecular level, at an atomic level. And the bridges are only 2 or 3 atoms long. And the nodes are single metals, and you get these beautiful open architectures, and you get very high surface areas. We're talking the same surface area as a football field for every gram of material that you have. So what we do is we then optimize the internal surface chemistry to be highly selective for the hydrogen gas. But you can also tune it for uptake of ions, and there are MOFs that are really good at adsorbing lithium and sodium, and they're being investigated as cathodes and anodes for the next generation batteries. They can be used for catalysis. So there's actually a sister group, a chemistry group of ours that I did a bit of research work when I was a student with Diana De Alessandro that does carbon dioxide and capture and conversion, so catalytic conversion of the CO2 inside the MOF. You get sort of special chemistry that they can then tune and control and turn it into methanol or methane or something like that. It's a very new field that, really only exists since 1999. I joined the research group at the Cameron Keppett's lab in 2010 and did my honours in 2011 and PhD from 2012 to 2015. And, I didn't realise how early I was in that space. Like it felt like it had been around a long time. And the reason I actually leaned into Cameron's group is because he talked about hydrogen in a third-year lecture, and I was like, hydrogen's cool. That's like, I didn't think it was going to be commercial within my lifetime, but I knew it had a big role to play at some point in the next 50 years. And I thought, this is pretty cool. And I'd been actually quite heavy at the time in my undergrad on the medicinal side of chemistry and looking at pharmacology and that sort of stuff. And I thought, maybe I'll do something more crystal engineering and hydrogen storage because it's kind of a bit different. Like no one's talking about it, and it could have, it's such a new chemistry. It was like, this is great. It's wide open field and lots of really interesting work. And also the crystals were very pretty. They were, lots of beautiful colors, and, it's a very appealing chemistry, whereas like medicinal chemistry, you get lots of white powders. It's not as sort of visually appealing as inorganic chemistry. So I suppose I just sort of leaned in because of the kind of the vibe, and also Cameron's a wonderful, wonderful professor. And we've actually, ever since that time, we've had basically a continuous working relationship, even though I've sort of been in research. I left research for 4.5 years, and then I've come back and started a research collaboration with him. But we've stayed friends that whole era.
Is he on the board at Rux? I saw his name on the website.
Yeah, so he's our chief scientist, and he's effectively his role is to lead the research direction of our group. If you think of Cochlear as a much, much, much bigger sort of Australian manufacturing scale-up company, they'll have a research division that does the breakthrough innovation for the next generation, and then they'll have development teams that take those new discoveries and work them up and test them and trial them, and then they go into a productizing and manufacturing. And so he's really at that pointy R end of research, and he's a fantastic research leader where he is a key opinion leader globally for MOFs. particularly in hydrogen storage. And so he's solely focused on that end, but then has a lot of interesting insights around the systems as they scale up into tanks. So yeah, we've got a fantastic ongoing relationship, and we invest a lot in the University of Sydney's both at a resource level and also in infrastructure, major equipment loans and that sort of stuff.
And so that's WTF and MOF is, plus a little extra. Tell me how TF they are made, please.
Yeah, these metal organic frameworks are made in water in a very slow synthesis. We try and decrease the rate at which they crystallize to be able to control the slow crystal growth to get the particle sizes just right. And so they slowly form over about an hour, and then we sort of centrifuge and wash them to make sure that there's no latent starting material, and then we pelletize them, and we use different methods to get them into a pellet format. And the reason we do that is really for safety and for other internal tank reasons. So from the safety side, these are inert, non-toxic, but they are insoluble powders, and we don't want people to handle powders out in market, because even any kind of fine powder, even if you have sand, if you were to grind it down to a fine powder and breathe it in, it would sit in your lungs and cause you problems in your lungs. So we pelletize them so that you can't easily just breathe them in as powders. And also the pellets can form a rigid body within the tank. So we don't have to form a big block of MOF to put in a tank. We can just create pellets that interlock with each other, and then that means that they're not going to shift around. And it's not such a big problem for buses, for example, but it is a big problem in aerospace. You need to make sure that whatever materials you have inside the tank, they're not going to shift as the plane bangs around. You don't want a big couple of kilos, 100 or so kilos of this material to be shifting as powders inside the tank. And so that's quite important to make sure that they interlock well.
I read an old IMCRC release, and they sponsored one of your projects a while back. It mentioned that there was currently no commercial continuous flow production of MOFs. Have things changed, and can you say something, please, about the stage of industrialization they're at?
We found a couple of small scale commercial production of MOFs, and there are lots of little groups popping up because MOFs are becoming quite an interesting space. But really, you can't off the shelf buy a really consistent batch of any MOF. Like if you were to go to the tier 1 chemical retailer in the world and you were to order a kilo of one of the very famous MOFs that is sort of a publicly known formula, the batches will give you different performance. If you were to run gas absorption on them, you get different performance with different batches. And it's still an emerging space around how do you create exactly the same crystal, structures, and to get the exact same, that consistency, or that sort of inconsistency of manufacturing approach means that we really have to do it ourselves. And we're also going to be going to a much bigger scale. I mean, we need to, on our most ambitious target, we would need to be making 75,000 tons of MOF a year by 2029, and that's just no one has ever made that much MOF. If you took all the MOF that's ever been made in the world, it wouldn't get to more than 1,000 tons. I would imagine. I think it's, people make grams to kilograms scale of this stuff at the moment for pilot lines and for testing of stuff, but I'm not aware of big scale-ups. I know BASF somewhere in Germany does do a lot of MOF production and research, but I'm not exactly aware of where they use those MOFs and in what context, because it's kept fairly high secret.
So it sounds like there's some work to do in scaling up as well as in probably standardization and quality control and all that other stuff that's less sexy than a super material.
That's right. Actually, that IMCRC project was specifically around the repeatability and reproducibility and quality assurance around, being able to make the material. We had a champion material, or a couple of champion materials actually. How do we make it the same batch, get the same performance every time, same yield, and I think that's, we managed to do that. It was a very, very small project, but we sort of got a lot out of it. And I think that sets us ahead of the pack in terms of being able to, especially with our subclass of material, be able to do that very reproducibly and scalably. So our challenge now is actually to really start ramping up and get initially to sort of 200 to 300 kilos a week, and then so 5 tons a week after that.
How do you incorporate them into a fuel canister? And tell me something about that and how they'd work and how they'd boost storage of hydrogen in a tank at not ultra high pressure.
Yeah, so we have to fill the tanks before they're valved and then place a valve in the tank. So we just literally like put the pellets in, and there's certain sort of IP around how they go in and getting really good packing densities and make sure you're trying to get as much MOF in there as possible. And then we sort of activate them using a process. And then once they're activated, the pores are ready to take the hydrogen in. And so we can then deliver that pretty much as a certified solution. So the people who would be buying our MOFs wouldn't be buying MOFs in bags or in bottles as powders or pellets. They would be just receiving the final tank solution, because we're taking on some of the risk around making sure they're certified to ISO TC1997's suite of standards around composite tanks.
Again, this is maybe going all over the place. Perhaps we'll edit this so it's in a more coherent order later, but whatever. Tell me, please, about the origin story for Rux and what led you, and it looks like some of your former research colleagues and probably others, to take the plunge and look for backers and formulate a business plan and all that fun stuff.
Look, I had this fantastic set of discoveries very late in my PhD. My PhD was quite dull. I had these wonderful, beautiful, colorful materials, but they just didn't uptake much hydrogen. And they were very interesting from other perspectives, from a magnetic perspective and electronic perspective, but gas absorption was just very, very ordinary. Mm-hmm. And then I had this second set of discoveries where all of a sudden I just stumbled upon this new family of materials, and I had about 4 months left in my PhD, and I basically just went, oh, this makes everything I've done for the last 3 or 4 years look pretty ordinary. So I just went absolutely pedal to the metal, and I was working like 18 hours a day to kind of run all the samples on the instruments. I stayed all through Christmas and New Year's. I got special permission to be in the labs, even though the chemistry building was in shutdown. I wasn't allowed to do any synthesis, but I could run the machines and do as much analysis as possible before it was due. And then we embarked on my PhD. We put invention disclosures in and negotiated to be able to pull the IP out from the university, because I owned the IP as a PhD student. But at the time, actually, then we had to, I talked to a bunch of investors and clean tech people at the time, and no one was interested in hydrogen in 2015-16. And I was broke. I'd spent all my money flying myself to go to Chicago to run one last big experiment to understand materials. So I actually went and took a job at KPMG. Very fortunately, the head of their research and development consulting group, Scott Olding, was just super excited by some of the stuff that I'd done, and thought I could really contribute to what ended up actually being a tax and incentive scheme and grant scheme. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know that. When I saw R&D consulting, I was like, oh, they must do research consulting. It's mostly tax. I went intentionally as well to KPMG to cut my teeth in commercial, because I'd been listening to a lot of podcasts by startup venture groups over in the US, like A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz, and other groups. I was really self-aware of how little I knew about innovation culture, product development, how to create a startup, how to fundraise. And so it was great being in KPMG, because I saw, I ended up having about 85 clean technology companies as my clients. And I was working directly with the CEOs, the founders, coming out, and I really saw what they were going through, and it's really, really hard. And, a lot of the companies didn't make it. And so working closely with them, I was learning from them. I was teaching them stuff about the stuff that KPMG had turned me into an expert on grants writing and tax policy and innovation policy. And then the community is very generous. And so I think I picked up a bunch of mentors and got really lucky. And then climate tech ecosystem started to change in 2018. And I noticed this big change. And so we decided that we'd done the patenting, started the patenting process, and we were like, let's have a little punt at trying to get something. And we did a little New South Wales government minimum viable product grant, 25K. We tried to get somewhere. We didn't really get anywhere, to be honest. It was just not enough. But the ecosystem kept moving, and we kept persisting. And then we started to get some better results. And at some point, I was actually sort of doing a little bit of both. I was working full-time at KPMG, using my income to pay for the patents and all that rubbish, and trying to pay for a postdoc on casual wages to sort of progress the technology and do more tests. And finally, I jumped ship, just took the plunge, and that was quite scary because we didn't have any funding. We had this IMCRC grant that was about 100K entirely going to the university, and we were matching it with 100K entirely going to the university, so a 200K project. Yep. Just to try and see where we got to, which paid for about 1.5 people. So one full-time person and one person on kind of part-time casual. And we just sort of had to try and get as far as we could. It was until the next milestone. So it was really jumping into the dark. I wasn't paying myself. I was sort of doing other bits and pieces of consulting here and there and just trying to keep the bills paid. And finally we won a couple of bigger grants, and that allowed us to kind of precipitate a little bit more angel funding and continue.
KPMG job sounds possibly unexciting for a hardcore nerd like yourself. You probably learnt an awful lot about the interface between people who are doing research of a fundamental and slightly further level and the public and everyone else in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it does. And KPMG was actually very kind and generous to me, and I would actually volunteer. I ended up being the national co-convener for the KPMG Pride Network, and we dragged the group to sort of our first 10 years, gold status with the Australian Workplace Equality Index. We took a lot of internal transformation, but that also gave me a lot of visibility across the firm. And, it's one of these places that's actually, it's an everything firm. It's not just tax and accounting. They do pretty much every industry, every element of consulting. It's like a really interesting place for a nerd to go into, because it's like there's so many experts and they're all quite knowledgeable in their fields. And the culture was very, there was people always wanting to teach me about their little corner of the world. And that's why I was like a sort of like a sponge myself, just soaking up all the knowledge about ag tech and the integration of energy and ag sort of interface, and how regional Australia sort of works with corporate Australia. And there's so many like elements to this. And the second thing you raised, which is coordination, is the biggest learning, because you had to make friends with a lot of people to get anything big done. And so when I went into the startup land, I went almost with a culture ingrained in me around like cooperation and coordination is the key. And it's so true. Like in startups, there are I reckon there are 15 other SME companies that actively support us by providing advice, linking us to people they're talking to. We share so much with each other to help each other out, because it's pretty brutal in the ecosystem. And so finding friends, your champions, they'll sing your praises and we'll sing their praises, and it makes life so much more enjoyable and easier. So really interesting learnings from that.
How many are on your team at the moment, and are you able to say anything about the investors who've helped you get this far?
We're about 11 of us right now, and we're hiring another 3 very shortly. And it's a small group, and we've been very lucky because we actually include our university 100% funded postdocs within that team, because we see ourselves as a pretty cohesive team. I basically lead all the research discussions with Cameron twice weekly at Sydney Uni, but then we have a laboratory at Cicada Innovations that we give the university people access to. So we have a very, very enmeshed culture. In terms of funding, we received CRCP round 11 grant, which we matched with some angel investment, basically from some close friends, high net worths, that were sort of willing to take a punt really on an idea, on a technology that hadn't yet been proven up in a tank, that we'd had sort of modeled the data, what we thought we were going to get. And they sort of went, okay, well, you better prove that in the next step. And so we're basically done that in this first year of the project, which sort of launched on January 1st, 2022. So now we're building a big rig in Victoria to kind of test it at a kind of commercial scale, where we've got sort of tanks that are at the small end for drones, 7.5 litres, and at the big end for sort of railway and ships, 3,300 litre tanks, and full of MOF. And so we're going to need a fair amount of support, I think, to actually get to that manufacturing readiness to those bigger tanks. But that's sort of support that we're putting grant applications in with state and federal governments to help us get manufacturing equipment in. And we're also looking at a kind of another capital raise to sort of take us to that next big manufacturing readiness milestone, where we can actually create commercial products that are fully certified through International Standards Org certifications and go through that final rigmarole productization process to take us to market.
Right. Will that be sort of next year, or can't say yet?
Yeah, we can't say yet because there's a few different moving parts. It could be this year, actually. To be honest, I don't know because we have 3 different sort of strategies that we're kind of just trying to understand ourselves. And the reason this is actually I was very fortunate to be invited to the Abu Dhabi World Future Energy Summit back in January, just a couple of weeks ago. And we met an enormous number of some of the biggest people in hydrogen and biggest people in energy, like oil and gas as well. And New South Wales government, their trade commissioner, Moen Anwar, connected us into also some really, really powerful energy people. And so we've since, come back and digested that. We are kind of reviewing our strategy and going, okay, well, actually the market is moving much, much more quickly than we thought. And we might need to bring forward the investment and parallelize a lot more of what we're doing. It's a high risk pathway, but it's certainly something that we can't miss the boat. And certainly the global south countries, they seem to be moving faster than the global north. So India, South Africa, a lot of the emerging economies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, are making big bets on hydrogen as part of their decarbonization strategy. And India in particular is just an absolute, it is the dragon that is awakening. And I don't think Australia really understands the importance of India's rise, and it's going to be a meteoric rise, similar to how China has risen, but it's going to be much more chaotic because it's not a centralized control economy. It is full chaos mode in India, and there's a lot of capital and a lot of very powerful figures that are just all pushing towards clean tech. Every single billionaire, every single industrial group has clean technology in their horizon. So I think we have to respond in a way that's going to position us well in 2025.
I believe I read something on, perhaps it was your website or perhaps I'm misremembering it, and I think it mentioned plans to develop a library of application-specific materials for hydrogen storage. Would you like to explain that perhaps, or would you like to talk about what you're focusing on currently in terms of application further than what you've mentioned above?
We have a couple of champion materials that we are sort of productizing in parallel with each other. And that's partly so that it's basically taking the pharmacology, big pharma approach to discovery, where you really want to take your champions in parallel as far as you can through the clinical trial point, just in case something goes wrong with one of the materials. One, maybe it's the flow rate, or maybe it's the way that they pack, or maybe the shelf life of one of the materials is not as good as the other. There's things that we can't foresee. We need to make sure that we're covering all our bases on. But also the needs of trucking and static hydrogen storage are different to the needs of aerospace. We're going to have 2 branches of materials that effectively do 2 slightly different things. So with aerospace, they're going to be much more gravimetrically optimized. So they're lighter materials, but those lighter materials will probably have fewer active nodes per kind of cubic volume. If you take a sort of a cubic centimeter of volume, the number of active sites, it'll be a lighter but less potent in its selectivity. And so it's a 2-parameter problem in aerospace. We're trying to maximize that volume and get that up to 2, maybe 3x volumetric uptake, but not add so much weight to the tank that the plane manufacturers are like, we don't have to lug this around. And rate's a big issue. The weight is a reason why batteries are not going to be commercialized for aerospace long term, because batteries are absolutely massively heavy. They're not even 10 times off. They're 50 times away from being efficient for heavy lift aero, where with a hydrogen, you start with a very, very light gas, but the tanks that hold them are really heavy. And so you're trying to make the tanks as light as possible using composite materials. And then if you're going to add the MOF material to the body of the tank, you want to make that as light as possible as well. So it's a slightly different problem to trucks, where actually they just want maximum volume, because maximum volume means maximum range, or they can pivot to a lower pressure. And that allows them to use cheaper regulators and valves and tubes that are rated at 100 or 200 bar instead of a 350 bar, which is a very specialized ultra high pressure gas rating, which has its own certification protocols, because anything above 200 is considered non-standard and specialist. So it just saves bus companies a lot of money if you can run a 200 bar pressure, and bus companies may not care so much about ultra long range. 600 kilometers would be great for them, whereas the big Class 8 trucks need to do 1,200, 1,500 kilometers per refuel easily, sometimes more than that.
I'd like to get your point of view on green hydrogen, which is obviously something you're very interested in, and the current high prices of it sort of make it unfeasible for just about everything, but obviously they will come down and they need to. Tell me, please, about how you see the market developing and what will drive the cost down.
Green hydrogen is interesting because I think people like to compare green hydrogen to grid power. And I just don't think it's really a fair comparison. So our learnings from going to the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in Pittsburgh with NERA and the Minister Chris Bowen back in September last year, in FCEL in Stuttgart, where we won the Hydrogen Prize there, and then a few weeks ago at the Future Summit, was hydrogen is there to displace diesel. So diesel generator sets you'll see on construction yards, in regional areas, on farms, in remote communities, as emergency power for hospitals, in random, very far away Pacific Island nations where it's very, very difficult to establish a grid because the infrastructure is dependent on maybe a big government organization that doesn't really care about you as a community, or maybe there's just too few people to bother putting a transmission line out. Or perhaps the grid exists, like in case of a hospital, but if the grid goes down, the hospital has to still run. And hydrogen is a very, very useful store of energy that is very high resilient. And the resilience is important because batteries, great for overnight power, great for 2-3 days, but you can't store energy in a battery for weeks, months, years. And there are a couple of battery chemistries like flow batteries that might be able to do that, but they're about 17 times the cost of a regular battery. So we need something that's going to be pretty much on par in terms of cost and storage costs, and our materials, our storage packs will be actually much cheaper than current battery stacks. But the important thing is not the cost. The important thing is the usability, the ability to transport a large amount of power, a large amount of electrons over a mountain or where there's no grid power, and it's just, you just need to get the energy there in some format. And so that's where we come in. In terms of the cost of hydrogen, the gate price, which is what they use, we have regular discussions with ARENA and with other energy groups like IRENA in Europe and the IEA serve on a quarterly basis. They all think that the cost of green hydrogen will reach about $2 a kilo by 2028, 2029, which makes it on par with grey hydrogen, which is made from coal or methane reformation, and should continue falling to $1 a kilo, maybe even less than $1 per kilo, which would make it very, very, very efficient. It basically tracks with the cost of solar, which is about a 21% learning rate per year. And there was actually a very interesting energy futurist, Ramez Naam, who more than 20 years ago predicted that 2020, 2021 would be the inflection point for solar, because he tracked that the learning curve was very consistent by Wright's law. And as solar went to scale, you'd get cheaper and cheaper, and the $1 per kilowatt hour was going to drop. And hydrogen is tracking much faster than that. And there's a reason that it's tracking with solar, so its learning rate is basically pegged to solar's learning rate. But hydrogen electrolysis itself is having its own learning rate, which is very, very fast. And there's companies like Hisato coming out of Wollongong doing incredible work, doing breakthrough efficiencies, well above 90%, that are going to revolutionize the way we even think about hydrogen in relation to other stores of energy. So our role, if Hisato solves electrolysis, we solve dispatchable storage of hydrogen. And the last piece is how to use hydrogen. There's companies in the sort of fuel cell and internal combustion engine space that are doing a lot of great work there. So look, it's early days. It's a very new industry, but the fact that South Africa is looking at 500 tons a day projects in a single project, same thing in Saudi and the UAE for their first projects, they're like 250 to 500 tons a day, and of solar and wind. This is not going anywhere. The big players are moving. They're moving fast. They're moving faster than I've seen any industry move ever. I'm only 36. It's not like I've been around forever. But it's like, it's kind of terrifying. Like, it's hard to even keep up and hold it all in your head. Like, what is going on? This energy transition is going to be the biggest thing that happens in our life, in humanity, since the age of coal 250, 300 years ago. And I think that's what we have to be sort of planning for, is a total flux and change in the energy use. I can't predict what it'll be, but I just know it's going to be very, very different.
It sounds like it's moving much quicker than people give it credit for based on what you've just said.
I think we base this, Australia, we have a very Eurocentric and American-centric view on this. The Americans weren't moving quickly. Now with their $700 billion Inflation Reduction Act, that is all targeted toward climate technologies and deployment. And so we're going to see the US massively leapfrog the EU on all things green, whether it's green hydrogen or batteries or solar or wind, whatever it is. US is absolutely catapulting. But actually, as I said, India, Middle East, they're moving just as quickly. And Australia, I think, needs to really reevaluate its strategy and invest hard, because it is becoming a laggard. We are very, very front-leading on technology, but we're sort of lacking on our kind of energy transition. And we're sort of lucky that we actually have a lot of rooftop solar. So individual citizens are very forward-thinking and are willing to invest. We have a bit of a head start on the kind of decarbonization of our grid. I think it's like 30% solar now or something like that. It's quite substantial, or maybe that's new deployments. But we need to go much, much harder and much faster to meet our kind of Paris targets for 2030.
And a recurring question in this series is, what's an issue in manufacturing that you believe isn't getting the attention it deserves?
I think market coordination is the key thing, and there's been a lot of focus on Industry 4.0 and advanced manufacturing. And really, I think the advanced manufacturers don't exist in a vacuum. Industry 4.0 is automation. It means using machines and AI to kind of get high productivity out of the production. But really, advanced manufacturers operate within an ecosystem of supply chain. We need to uplift older manufacturers who have a lot more experience than us new kids on the block, because they understand supply chain. They understand also how to do negotiated contracts, and they understand, they have the relationships with overseas suppliers, especially in Australia, where when the car industry shut down, we lost huge amounts of what I think of as prosaic manufacturing, basic chemicals and basic polymer manufacturing and that sort of stuff. So we're very thin on the ground in Australia in terms of, the number of suppliers and the depth and the size that they can supply in. And so I think coordinating the market, understanding who needs support, providing that new investment to kind of actually upgrade, upskill, increase the sort of the productivity of the sector is going to be key for us long term. And Australia really does need a sovereign manufacturing. Some people are like, don't need to make stuff. Why make it here? Why you just go overseas, make it somewhere else. Mm. And I think it doesn't align with the need to actually have the ability to make stuff for ourselves, for our own use. And we saw that in COVID. We weren't able to we sometimes had to wait 12, 15 months for stuff. And actually the hydrogen economy in Australia is being held back by the fact that we don't make ultra high pressure tanks in Australia. So we have a 15 to 18 month waiting list for some of the European countries to freight some of their tanks to us. But ultimately we're lower on the priority than the European countries who are also demanding those same things. We saw that with the vaccine rollout. Sure. Having CSL being a sovereign manufacturer of vaccines in Australia was absolutely crucial for us. And they do a really good job of coordinating with their supply chain ecosystem. So we need to do the same thing in other sectors, in energy and automotive, aerospace. So that's my big thing. Let's work together. Let's cooperate.
That's an admirable soapbox, and it's not too different from mine. Well, it's been a very enjoyable conversation, but we're sort of running way over time at the moment. I think in closing, I'd like to give you the floor if you have anything to plug or a final comment to make.
I don't have anything particular to plug other than watch this space. If you're interested in this space in terms of working with us or, becoming one of our champions, please reach out through our website or over LinkedIn. And we'd love to chat. We want to be a really collaborative participant within the new automotive and aerospace and decarbonization of sort of grid infrastructure, sort of ecosystems. And I'm keen to learn from others, and I'm also here to share sort of our learnings.
Okay, Jehan, it was a pleasure to have you on AU Manufacturing Conversations. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Really appreciate the time.
No worries.